Atlanta 911 operator 7054. What's the address of your name?
Yes, ma'am.
In the late hours of October, a mother faced a nightmare she never saw coming. Imagine the person you trust most betrays you in the most horrific way. This is a true story you won't believe. Stay with us as we uncover the shocking truth and the twist that stunned everyone. Welcome to True Crime Anatomy. Thank you to all my amazing subscribers, and may your families stay safe wherever you are. For those new here, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We bring you true crime stories from everywhere, unearthing the unheard and unseen. We work every day to bring you the most chilling and shocking cases. Today, we explore the case of Lamora Williams from Atlanta, Georgia. In 2017, Lamora was convicted of a crime so horrific, it left the world in shock. She was found guilty of killing her two sons, 𝐶𝐨𝐬 and 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞, in a way that no one could ever imagine, by placing them in an oven. Lamora Williams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 35 additional years. But what could have driven a mother to commit such an unspeakable act? Stay with us as we uncover the details behind this heartbreaking tragedy. Lamora Williams grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, a city known for its rich history, but also its share of hardships. From a young age, Lamora had a difficult life, one marked by struggles that many people would never see behind her smiles. She was raised in a family that faced challenges of their own, dealing with issues that affected their everyday lives. As she grew older, Lamora's life continued to be shaped by a series of events that pushed her toward the edge. Her mother, Brenda Williams, has spoken openly about Lamora's struggles with mental health. Brenda revealed that her daughter had been dealing with mental health challenges for years. These issues were not something new, but had been with Lamora for much of her adult life. Lamora was known to have periods of emotional instability, and her mental health battles seemed to be getting worse over time. Brenda had long been concerned for her daughter's well-being, but she never imagined that things could take such a tragic turn. Lamora's relationship with her children's father, 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐿, was complicated. They had been in a relationship for years, but things had begun to fall apart before the incident. They were no longer together when the tragic events unfolded, which created a level of tension in their lives. The breakup seemed to have had a deep impact on Lamora, as she found herself raising 3 children alone. 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐿 had his own struggles, trying to make sense of the situation and maintain his role as a father, but the relationship between him and Lamora was strained. Despite the challenges in her personal life, Lamora was known to be a mother who cared for her children, at least on the surface. Before the crime, people in her community saw her as a loving mother. She had 2 young sons, 𝐶𝐨𝐬𝐫𝐞, who was only 1 year old, and 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞, just 2 years old. Lamora's bond with her children seemed strong, and she often posted pictures on social media showing moments of joy with her kids. But behind the social media posts and in the moments that others didn't see, Lamora's mental health struggles were taking a toll. Lamora had 1 other child who was not involved in this tragic event, a fact that raised many questions after the deaths of 𝐶𝐨𝐬𝐫𝐞 and 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞. Her family dynamics were complex. Lamora's mother, Brenda, had tried to help her daughter raise the children when she could, but Lamora often felt overwhelmed. She seemed to be carrying a lot of emotional weight that no one could truly understand. Brenda has spoken about her daughter's deep struggles and how Lamora's emotional state seemed to shift unpredictably, leaving her family constantly unsure of what to expect. On the day of the crime, Lamora left her children in the care of a caregiver. The details surrounding this caregiver remain a part of the puzzle that people continue to try to understand. Lamora had worked during the day, and when she came home that evening, she found her 2 young sons dead. The caregiver's role has been questioned in the aftermath of the crime, as many wonder what role they might have played in the tragedy. Were the children safe during the time they were left in the caregiver's care? Or was there something that led to this devastating outcome? For Lamora, it was a mix of personal battles, mental health challenges, and a series of events that led to that horrific moment. Many people had difficulty reconciling the mother they thought they knew with the one who committed such a violent crime. But when Lamora called 911 that night, It became clear that something was terribly wrong. She was distraught, claiming that she had just found her children dead.
Man for 911, operator 7054, what's the address of your name?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I have a question, and this is a serious matter.
What happened between the time she left the children with the caregiver and when she returned to find them lifeless? Those moments remain a mystery that continues to haunt the story. Through all of this, 𝐿amora's emotional state and history of mental illness played a key role in understanding what led to the unthinkable act that shocked the world. Those who knew her were left to ask the question, could she have been reaching out for help long before the tragedy occurred? Could someone have noticed the signs of her struggle before it was too late? The answers, for now, are unclear. But what is certain is that the emotional toll on 𝐿amora and her family was immense. 𝐿amora Williams arrived home late that night, expecting to find her children safe after a long day of work. But what she discovered when she stepped into her apartment was beyond anything she could have imagined. The scene that greeted her was horrific. 𝐶𝐨, just 1 year old, and 𝐬𝐮n𝐬𝐜, 2 years old, were lifeless on the floor. The stove, somehow tipped over, rested on 𝐶𝐨's head. 𝐿amora's first reaction was to call 911, and she spoke in a panic, trying to make sense of the chaos around her. When I came in, the stove was laying on my youngest son's head, and my other son was laid out on the floor with his brains laid out on the floor, she told the dispatcher, her voice trembling with fear. The dispatcher tried to calm her down as 𝐿amora desperately pleaded for help. Can you please help me? Can you please tell me? I don't want to get locked up because this is not my fault. I had just came home from work, she continued, her voice filled with terror. The dispatcher could hear the urgency in her tone, but the details were so shocking that they didn't immediately make sense. Meanwhile, 𝐿amora's children's father, 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐽, was also on the phone, having just received a video call from 𝐿amora. He had seen his children's lifeless bodies on the screen. I just received a call from my child's mother that my 2 dead babies, my sons are dead in an apartment, he told the dispatcher. His voice was shaky, overwhelmed with disbelief as he tried to make sense of the horrifying scene. She video called me, and I seen it. I really think they are dead. When the police arrived at the scene, they were immediately confronted with the grim reality. The bodies of the 2 children lay on the floor, each showing signs of the horrific injuries they had suffered. 𝐶𝐨 and 𝐬𝐮n𝐬𝐜 both had burn marks on their bodies. The scene suggested that they had been exposed to intense heat for a prolonged period. Investigators observed the position of the stove and noted the disturbing positioning of 𝐶𝐨, with the stove resting on his head. It was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. The police found 𝐿amora in a state of shock, struggling to make sense of what she had just found. But the details of the crime scene told a different story. The burn marks on the children's bodies, the unnatural positioning of the stove, and the gruesome way the bodies were discovered all pointed to something far more deliberate and horrifying than 𝐿amora's description suggested. The sight of the 2 young children, their bodies battered by the intense heat, was enough to shake anyone to the core. The chilling scene left investigators questioning how this could have happened, how 𝐿amora could have come home to such a devastating sight, and why the children were left in such a disturbing state. The moment the police arrived at 𝐿amora Williams' apartment, they were immediately struck by the disturbing scene before them. 𝐶𝐨 and 𝐬𝐮n𝐬𝐜 were both dead, their tiny bodies showing signs of horrific injuries. The officers surveyed the room, taking in the burn marks on the children's bodies and the unsettling position of the stove. It didn't take long for the police to realize that something was wrong. Very wrong. 𝐿amora's frantic 911 call had painted a picture of a mother in shock, but the physical evidence before them told a different story. 𝐿amora had claimed that she found her children like this after returning home from work. But when the police arrived, they found something that didn't match her description. 𝐶𝐨's body was positioned under the stove, while 𝐬𝐮n𝐬𝐜 lay nearby, both with signs of severe burns. The police could immediately tell that the children had been subjected to extreme heat. The injuries were not consistent with 𝐿amora's account, leaving investigators to question the truth behind her words. How could the stove end up on top of her son's head? Why was 𝐾𝐨𝐧'𝐭 lying in such a disturbing position? These questions weighed heavily on the investigators as they began to process the scene. In addition to 𝐿𝐿𝐴's 911 call, which was emotional and full of panic, there was another key piece of evidence. The video call 𝐿𝐿𝐴 had made to 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐜𝐫𝐞, the children's father. 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐜 had witnessed the horrific sight of his sons lying lifeless on the floor, and his voice, full of shock and disbelief, was captured during the call. "I just received a call from my child's mother that my 2 dead babies. My sons are dead in apartment," 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐜 told the dispatcher, his words heavy with grief. The video call had shown him the reality of the situation, and now his perspective would be vital in understanding what had happened. The police also began to examine the medical examiner's report, which confirmed what they had already suspected. 𝐶𝐿 and 𝐾𝐨𝐧'𝐭 had both suffered burn injuries consistent with prolonged exposure to high heat. The burn marks indicated that they had been placed in an oven, a horrifying possibility that seemed to match the evidence found at the scene. The autopsy confirmed that the children's deaths were caused by thermal injuries, which only deepened the mystery. What could have led 𝐿𝐴 to take such a horrific step? Was it an accident, or was there more to the story? The conflicting accounts between 𝐿𝐴's description of events and the physical evidence left the investigators struggling to piece together the timeline of the crime. 𝐿𝐴 had said she came home to find her children dead, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The burns on the children's bodies pointed to a period of exposure to heat before their deaths. Was 𝐿𝐴 telling the truth, or was she trying to cover up something darker? As the police continued to examine the scene and gather evidence, they could not ignore the possibility that 𝐿𝐴 had been involved in the deaths of her children. The timeline of the crime became one of the most difficult puzzles to solve. The police tried to piece together the events leading up to the moment 𝐿𝐴 discovered her children's bodies. 𝐿𝐴 had left her children with a caregiver earlier in the day, but what had happened during the hours she was gone? Was the caregiver involved in any way? Or had 𝐿𝐴 returned home to find her children in this state, as she claimed? The more the investigators looked into the timeline, the more questions arose, and the clearer it became that they would need to dig deeper to find the truth. Forensic experts worked tirelessly to analyze the burn marks and the time of death. Their findings pointed to the fact that the children had been exposed to heat for a prolonged period, likely in the hours before 𝐿𝐴 returned home. This meant that the children's deaths had occurred after she had left for work, but before she arrived back at the apartment. The exact time of death remained uncertain, but the evidence showed that 𝐿𝐴's version of events didn't line up with the physical evidence. The burns on the children's bodies were too severe to be accidental, and the scene was too disturbing to suggest anything other than deliberate harm. As the investigation continued, the emotional toll on everyone involved became more apparent. 𝐬𝐿𝐴, the children's father, was devastated by what he had seen in the video call, and the weight of the situation seemed to haunt him. 𝐿𝐴's family was torn apart by the tragedy, with her mother, Brenda Williams, speaking publicly about her daughter's mental health struggles. Brenda had long been concerned about 𝐿𝐴's well-being, but no one could have predicted the horror that would unfold. The police, meanwhile, were left with the task of untangling the web of conflicting stories and evidence. Was 𝐿𝐴 the grieving mother she claimed to be, or was there more to the story? The physical evidence, including the burn marks and the positioning of the bodies, suggested that the truth was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. As the investigation progressed, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. But the questions surrounding 𝐿𝐴's actions remained unanswered. What had led her to commit such a brutal act? The answers were still elusive, and the investigation was far from over. As the investigation unfolded, the question on everyone's mind was, why did 𝐿𝐴 Williams do this? What could drive a mother to commit such an unimaginable act? Several theories began to emerge, each trying to explain what led to the deaths of her 2 young children. One theory that gained attention was 𝐿𝐴's struggles with mental health. She had a history of emotional instability, and her mother, Brenda Williams, had spoken openly about Lamora's ongoing battles with mental illness. Could Lamora have snapped under the pressure of her personal struggles? Could her mental state have deteriorated to a point where she lost control? Many close to Lamora believed that her emotional state had worsened in the months leading up to the crime, particularly after her breakup with 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐽, the father of her children. It's possible that the stress of raising 3 children alone, combined with the emotional weight of the separation, pushed her over the edge. Some speculated that the crime could have been a desperate act, one that wasn't planned, but rather driven by a sudden burst of anger or frustration. The loss of control could have been the result of a breakdown, with Lamora perhaps feeling overwhelmed by her situation. But then, there were others who believed this act was more calculated, a deliberate decision to harm her children. Could it have been premeditated? The burn marks on the children's bodies, the position in which they were found, it all suggested something more than just a momentary lapse in judgment. Could Lamora have planned this out? Or was it simply a tragic outburst that spiraled into something irreversible? Some people saw her as a victim of her circumstances, a mother struggling with mental illness who snapped under pressure. Others saw her as a cold, calculating killer, driven by something far darker than anyone could understand. The way the story was presented in the media influenced the public's perception, making it difficult to know what to believe. What do you think? Do you believe Lamora's mental health played a major role in this tragic crime? Was this a case of a mother who simply snapped, or was there something more at play? Could this have been prevented? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. After the crime, the legal system moved quickly to bring the case to trial. Lamora Williams was charged with the brutal deaths of her 2 young sons, 𝐸𝐻 and 𝐾𝐨𝐧'𝐭. The trial was an emotional roller coaster, with both sides presenting their cases to the court. The prosecution painted a heartbreaking picture of the children's deaths, showing the jury the shocking details of how the boys were killed and the devastating burn marks on their bodies. For the families, this trial was a painful reminder of their loss, and the courtroom became a place of raw emotion. Throughout the trial, Lamora's family members, including her mother, Brenda Williams, were forced to confront the horror of the situation. The jury, however, had made their decision. Lamora was found guilty, and the judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 35 years. Their grandparents, aunts, and uncles were left with memories of what could have been, haunted by the thought of the children's short lives being ended in such a brutal way. Lamora's mother, Brenda, continued to grieve for her grandchildren, while also struggling with the fact that her daughter had been found guilty of such a terrible crime. The trial's resolution, with Lamora's life sentence, brought a sense of closure to the legal process, but for those involved, it didn't bring the healing they needed. The emotional aftermath for both families was far-reaching. The pain of losing the children was impossible to escape, and Lamora's actions left a permanent mark on everyone who loved her. As Lamora begins her sentence, the questions of what led to the crime and whether it could have been prevented will continue to linger. As the case of Lamora Williams comes to an end, it leaves us with some hard questions. Was justice truly served? Lamora's conviction, her life sentence without parole, and the additional 35 years all point to a conclusion that the court believed she was responsible for the deaths of her children. But as we look at the bigger picture, we can't help but wonder about the role of mental health in this tragedy. Lamora's history of mental health issues was known to her family and even to those close to her. Her mother, Brenda, has spoken about her daughter's struggles for years, and many believe Lamora was never given the help she needed. If Lamora had received better care, could this tragedy have been avoided? Should the justice system have taken her mental health struggles into account more deeply? The case raises important questions about how society handles mental illness, especially when it intersects with such a horrific crime. Was Lamora truly in control of her actions, or was she a victim of her own mental state? As we reflect on this case, we must ask, how can the justice system better handle situations like this in the future? Should more attention be paid to the mental health of individuals involved in such crimes? What do you think about Lamura's conviction? Was it fair, considering her mental health issues? Could justice have been served differently in this case? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case both heartbreaking and shocking, hit that like button and subscribe for more in-depth true crime documentaries. We bring you real, untold stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support helps us continue to explore these complex and chilling cases. Would you like to see more cases like this? Let us know in the comments below. We want to hear your thoughts on Lamura's case, and if you want to see more true crime stories that dig deep into the darkest parts of human nature, we're here to share them. In our next episode, we'll uncover another chilling true crime case that will make you question everything you thought you knew. Don't miss it.